Good morning. The government is really turning the screws on Chinese firms. The latest plan this time is to ensure that no mobile phone company buys Chinese equipment at all. No telco that has any Chinese equipment, Financial Express reports, will be allowed to buy spectrum from the government of India in the future. Presumably, this will only apply to future purchases, since most telcos already have significant amounts of Chinese equipment. This is critical, as if it applies to even past purchases, it can significantly drive up costs and disrupt networks, as telcos will have to rip out their Chinese components. Driving up costs even for future equipment actually can be quite worrying, since the government has done enough to drive the industry into the ground. In fact, it seemed a bit unfair to ask the telecom companies to pay a price when they're already paying a huge price for poor government policy. India Inc. has responded a lot better to the COVID crisis than most of us expected. In the first quarter, revenues fell by just 17%, but more important, expenditures fell by even faster, as a result of which operating margins grew. Sustaining this, of course, is going to be a challenge, since with incomes coming down, consumer sentiment is quite poor, and as we have talked about in the past, the investment climate is remarkably poor in the country right now. As India nears 14 lakh COVID cases, Prime Minister Narendra Modi does well to caution citizens that they should not be jettisoning their masks right now. As he said, the virus is as dangerous as it was in the past. So this is not a time to be losing steam and taking off your mask and not maintaining social distance. In fact, what is very important, going by the press release put out by the Prime Minister's office over the weekend, is that later today, the Prime Minister is going to launch 3 high throughput testing facilities. One of the big problems with the COVID-19 fight, as we said before, in fact our lead editorial is about that today. One of the 5 big problems really is the poor quality of testing. In fact, we had a page 1 graphic on it over the weekend. Essentially what it says is, or what the editorial is telling us and what the graphic is saying in the same word, in saying also, is that there is really little point ramping up the testing if the results of those tests are not going to be accurate. In fact, they're going to be so inaccurate that they give us a false sense of complacency. Just imagine that a day or two after the Delhi Sero survey told us that a fourth of Delhi's population had been infected by the coronavirus, the Delhi test told us that just 6% of those being tested every day were positive. In fact, what we found was that we look at the rapid antigen test, or the RAT. If you look at the RAT, most of the tests being done in Delhi now are through the RAT, but the RAT actually catches just about a third of the infections that the RT-PCR does. So if Prime Minister Modi wants to actually turn around India, then he has to increase the number of RT-PCR tests. There's another problem here that he needs to look after, which is that the RAT is much cheaper than the RT-PCR. So most state governments would prefer to use the RAT test. So if the states have to do more RT-PCR, essentially Prime Minister Modi has to start giving them more money from the PM CARES fund. There's good news on the MGN Narega front. Within just a few months, as our anchor story points out, within just a few months, most state governments have achieved around half the target for the full year. In fact, you would recall that even the year's target was quite ambitious compared to what it was last year. But, and here's the problem, the scheme itself guarantees around 100 days of work in a year, yet up till now, the governments have never managed to give more than 50 days in a year. Now this is something which clearly needs to change. At least in this pandemic, the governments need to give people 100 days of work. In fact, a related problem is that while you have the Narega in rural India, you have no equivalent of this in urban India. In fact, it's pretty safe to say that if you had a Narega type scheme in urban India, a large part, or at least a significant part of the migrant crisis would not have happened, because migrants then wouldn't have had to rush home when they found that their jobs in urban India had been lost. Just before its privatization, oil major BPCL is giving VRS to large sections of its staff. Now there's clearly a problem here, because when Air India was being sold, despite everyone telling the government that its large workforce was the problem, the government never offered a VRS for Air India. Now, we've clearly lost the opportunity now, but it just tells you that the government never took the business of selling Air India very seriously at that time, when it still had a good chance. If it had, then it would have offered a VRS and got rid of most of Air India's excess staff, and it would have taken over all the debt. It plans to do that now, but in all probability, it's unlikely to find a buyer. So we taxpayers are going to be left to fund that white elephant for many years to come. Blaming the government is par for the course for most of us, but what do you do when the highest court of the land itself is acting in a funny manner? Our editorial today is about two such cases. In one case, Advocate Prashant Bhushan made some tweets about some judges of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court wants to slap contempt charges on him. Given the caseload before the Supreme Court, does it really want to waste time on something like this? Secondly, which is really odd, the Supreme Court has sent a notice to the government of India asking it why it should not set up a separate fund for lawyers who have lost their jobs after Corona. Now, it's very good that the Supreme Court's heart bleeds for the lawyers, but almost everybody in India is in a similar situation. Finding that the Supreme Court is trying to bat for the lawyers is certainly a bit odd. Hope you had a great weekend and have a safe week ahead. Thank you.